to a certain degree. I mean, part of this is complicated because, in general, gay-only romances have not become a very big thing. You know, Steve Cortez and Samantha Trainor in Mass Effect were very revolutionary because they were not available to to what were considered more the majority.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal. And so, to a certain degree, you know, we're getting to the point where that might be more feasible and whatnot. And there are games that have also achieved that, although they're very few and far between. But especially in the female case, you tend to find very few, even just lesbian, not bisexual, lesbian female characters in video games. And part of that has to do with the demographic that is believed to be the majority because as developers, I mean, I see this all the time when it comes to romance. I mean, frankly, Neverwinter Nights, the original Neverwinter Nights, is a very cool, in a way of looking at how sexual diversity in video games has grown over time.
Yeah.
I mean, in a lot of different ways. Because Neverwinter Nights, you have, and generally in video games, you have sort of a hierarchy of sexuality. In general, the straight male is at the top, being the most catered to, having the most options. I mean, certainly we know in many cases that is true. Then a lot of the times you have the straight female underneath that who are given options here and there and whatnot. Then you've got lesbians and so forth, women who like women, who are given some content, but with a very higher degree, more frequency than the last tier, which tends to be gay men.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different reasons for that. I mean, going back to Neverwinter Nights, I play a lot of modules in Neverwinter Nights. A lot of very good fan-made modules and whatever, a lot of which, surprisingly, have romantic elements to them. And if you look on the page that lists all the modules from Neverwinter Nights that have romances in them, you will find that not only are a lot of not only does it stick to that hierarchy, generally the gay males have the absolutely select amount and the ones that have the gay male options or bisexual male options tend to be developed later because attitudes have changed over time. But you tend to find that female characters who like women are almost always bisexual and not lesbian.
Yeah.
Generally what you see, and this is actually true of the first Mass Effect, is you have one hetero option two options for heterosexual males, one option for straight females, and maybe one option for lesbian females. And usually you do that with three characters, one of which is straight, the male and female, and then you have a bisexual female, completely leaving gay males out of the equation because...
Thy name is Liara.
Yes, thy name is Liara. And actually, Liara, one of the fascinating things about Liara to me is that as a symbol, in a way, she sort of symbolizes what ended up sort of being agreed on as the key demographics of Mass Effect, not only because she's an alien and whatnot, but, I mean, you could argue, I think it's in Mass Effect 3 where basically we were talking about female shepherds being shafted heavily earlier, and the truth is you end up in Mass Effect 3 with more lesbian options to a certain degree, possibly, than you do options for straight women.
Because there's Kelly Chambers, too, right.
Yeah, Kelly Chambers, you got Diana Allers, you got Samara, mostly in Citadel, DLC and whatnot. I mean, and Citadel DLC went out of its way to amend this, and it was very good of BioWare to do, but in the base game, you end up with, I mean, you know, there's still a certain balance level to it, because in the end, you know, the female options tended more onto the side of flames. You did have some serious romances that came out of it that sort of were on par with the gay male romances that were given for and whatnot. But, I mean, you could sort of argue by the sheer number of romances, not necessarily the quality, but by the sheer number of romances that actually play out through the series, you could actually argue that the two major demographics that BioWare focused on in Mass Effect were, of course, straight men who blow everyone else out of the water, and surprisingly, lesbian women. And that's, I would like to think, pretty much encapsulated in the appeal and the spokesmanship almost of Liara, because you wanted to give progressive options, but you didn't necessarily, in the first two Mass Effects, want to have female characters who only liked women, and therefore the guys couldn't go for them because it would hurt their feelings or something. So a lot of the women ended up being bisexual. And so, in a weird sense, the bisexual women ended up outnumbering the straight men, or bisexual men, for that matter.
Go ahead, Kathleen.
And it's fascinating.
I think it's, well, first of all, like, I think that's really sad that it's so rare to find a male-on-male romance in a game. I think that's partially because a lot of men feel uncomfortable watching two men kiss. Yeah. I don't know. A lot of straight women have no problem watching two girls kiss. Like, it's not that uncomfortable because I think girls are just more comfortable with themselves when it comes to touching each other, like, because we're cuddly in general.
Right.
Well, society allows us to be cuddly.
Yeah.
They don't really allow men to be cuddly.
Yeah.
And, but the thing is, I think even though it looks like there's more lesbian romances in games, a lot of those lesbian romances are for straight men.
Yes.
Yes. And that's the other.
Most of those romances don't appeal to me at all. I did not have anything. There was nothing at all appealing about Kelly Chambers to me, or Samantha Trainer, because there was very little romance in those romances. It was mostly sexual, which is really more for the male audience. I think that's one thing that, like, game companies need to realize. If they're going to appeal to a lesbian audience, there's got to be romance in it, because we love that stuff. You know, like, I think
that's how you know that
emotional attachment, I think, because we're still girls. Like, just because we're lesbians doesn't mean we're just obsessed with boobs and the female anatomy. Like, there's still a lot of emotion that comes into play in relationships.
Right, I agree.
And, like, I think, actually, to be perfectly honest, the Liara romance in the first game, I didn't like it because it was way too sexual. She came off as sexual, like, right away. It wasn't until the second game with Lair of the Shadow Broker that I fell in love with Liara. That's why romance, one of the reasons why I romance Kaden, because I felt there was no other options.
Okay.
So, because there was Kaden or Liara, and Liara, there wasn't much romance in that relationship. So I just, like, I'm going to go with the, you know, romance, because one thing that a lot of people don't know is that, like, actually lesbians prefer to watch gay, like, male-on-male romance than female romance, because there's typically more affection in it. And, like, girls, like, I can watch, like, even if it's not a gay romance, like, I can watch, like, The Notebook or whatever and enjoy it.
Right.
Because there's romance in it. Right. But if there's no romance in it, I'm like, I'm done, you know? But I really think they did a good job with her on Mass Effect 3, because it was very tender, like, the whole romance throughout that game. And I think that's one thing that, like, game companies need to realize is that, you know, romance is really important when you're trying to appeal to the lesbian crowd, so, or any crowd,
that's absolutely correct what you are saying. And so the truth is straight men still win by far, because it is true. Whenever you do the female-female romances in Mass Effect, you do still get the sense of who they're trying to appeal to. So it's very true. I mean, you know, there probably is some appeal to be found for lesbians as well. And, you know, you're talking about the particular instance for you and whatnot, but I know that you said in one of your videos, Kathleen, you talked about the Samantha Trainer romance, and it's kind of true. You start to get the feeling that a straight male wrote it. I don't actually know who specifically wrote it. I did not think to look that up, but, you know, maybe you wouldn't be.
One game that I think represents the hierarchy that you were describing very well, Jonathan, is Jade Empire, because this is a game where you had two female romances for straight men, you had one male romance for straight women, and that one male romance could be a same-gender romance, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And then one of the two females that I talked about is bisexual and could be a romance for a female. And if you happen to be a gay male like myself, it was, in that game, a huge uphill climb to be able to acquire the male romance, because you had to be downright nasty to the two female romances. Like, you had to be nasty to them. Not just indifferent, like, just insult them. And then, if you chose the right dialogue, then you could romance the same gender male romance. So whereas with the female, I don't know if in the female you had to be downright nasty to the guy in order to be able to unlock the ability. That might be true, but at least you only had to be nasty to one person and not two people. So BioWare has wisened up since then. I mean, again, this is like in the earlier stages when BioWare was still experimenting a lot.
Yeah, they were just so worried about straight men complaining about, oh no, I didn't want this, and, people boycotting the game. I mean, and those were legitimate concerns back then. I mean, you have to give BioWare some credit where it's due for a lot of this. In some cases, people maybe give too much credit. In some cases, they maybe don't give enough.
Yeah.
You have to give them credit for being progressive for the time.
Yeah, it was definitely very frustrating. Yeah. And another thing that I think relates to what Kathleen was asking, which is the portrayal of lesbians versus gay males. Dragon Age Origins, I wasn't really a huge fan of Zevran as a romance, and I know there's a lot of Zevran fans out there, and I know that
has his appeal.
He has his appeal. I think the problem was with Zevran, at least at face value, and I know he's a deeper character than this when you get into his romance, but in face value, I considered him very stereotypical, and in the sense that he was a very promiscuous male, pretty much flirted with both men and women alike, and he was very, very sexual. And
this was before Grindr. Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, that was one of the things that turned me off from Zevran, and another reason why I was so upset that at least in the vanilla game without any mods, he was the only
Alistair wasn't
same
enough.
gender. Because Alistair is more of that's the thing that hurts so much, is that I feel like a lot of people might think that gay people prefer the sexual, non-romantic. Again, like Zevran's,
and it comes right down to stereotypes.
Yeah, Zevran, to his credit, does become romantic like near the very end. But I loved Alistair's character. Alistair's romance was something that I would love to have had as a gay male, but only straight women could have it, because I guess at the time they thought straight women would appreciate that more than a gay male who was more interested in having sexy happy times with Zevran, at least initially.
Yeah, and there's other reasons for it.
Sexy happy times.
I mean, and one thing that is very apparent, I mean, if you look at the whole span of gaming history with fantasy roleplaying and romance options, I mean, okay, so you basically see a very big inclination to have the characters who are more religious are almost always completely straight.
You're talking about Sebastian. Yes.
Yeah, okay, yes. This is where I'm getting back to Sebastian.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I think this is exactly why they made him only straight.
Because it's religion.
I feel like they probably, because he's religious. And I feel like that people are still really, really just uncomfortable with the idea of someone attracted also to their own gender, even if it's both, being religious. And I think some of that went into Alistair as well. I think maybe not quite as much. I think there were a few other things that went into that. But I think, I mean, you look all across the board. I mean, even in some like Neverwinter Nights modules that are more progressive and stuff like that, you never see a male character at the very least. Now, this is actually what makes the difference. I have actually seen female characters attracted to women who are religious.
Liliana's example.
Liliana's an example. There's examples in Neverwinter Nights modules. For whatever reason, religious women are allowed to be whatever sexuality they want, for the most part. I mean, obviously, that's not true all across the board, but you see much more of that.
Interesting.
Whereas the gay men or the bisexual men always have this inclination towards villainy, towards roguism, however appealing they might be, however good of characters they may be in the end, they always have these stereotypes associated with them, one of which is that they're never religious, interestingly. And I don't give too much credence to that. I mean, myself, but it's just, you see the patterns, and it does get kind of frustrating. It keeps things kind of stale, and I know it's...
I agree with you. I do find it interesting that the lesbians, the bisexual or the LGBT characters tend to be more of the roguish characters, because Zevran and Liliana were both rogues, and I guess less of the more conservative.
Art, snipers. If you got an option that's supposed to be attracted to their own sex, they are usually more of a more depraved nature, which goes way back to whenever in like film and comic books you were not allowed to show an LGBT individual unless they were, say, a villain, etc. I mean, I think there were actually legitimate rules about that, and I think it made a big impact on how they're seen just all across the board, because people have a hard time seeing them as anything but depraved. And so that is a huge shame, and I'm really, and that's changing a little bit too. I mean, I guess you could say one of the nice things about Anders in Dragon Age 2, apart from the other maybe issues with his sexual orientation or whatnot, is that he at least was, to a certain degree, a man of the maker.
Yes.
He was indignant for obvious reasons, but he believed in whatnot. So again, that's shifting ever so slightly over time. But I think Sebastian was kind of a slap in the face to that. It just, in case we had forgotten that was the case, I think that was just the way it was. And again, you have to give BioWare some credit. Yeah. They may sometimes there's just a matter of not alienating. Yeah. There's just a matter of just not making people angry in general.
I find that interesting because I personally consider myself actually quite religious, and I think Kathleen identifies herself as religious. Is that right, Kathleen? So, or I don't know where you are at your life.
It depends on what day.
It depends on the day.
Yeah, no, I am really spiritual, actually.
Spiritual, yeah.
So I think that's weird. I do know a lot of LGBT people that are really religious and spiritual. So yeah, I think, and honestly, the idea of like a religious like LGBT character is like really attractive to me. I think that's kind of hot. Like I don't know, you could roll with that. You could have like a roguish like you could have a roguish lesbian monk.
That's true. I think
you could have both of those things.
I think I feel on a personal level sometimes I don't want to. Persecute is not the right word, but I think that there is as a religious LGBT person, I tend to get criticism not only from the straight side of the straight crowd or audience, but also from the gay crowd or audience, because there's a lot of criticism over why are you religious. Because I'm Catholic. Not only am I religious, I'm Roman Catholic, which is not in the traditional church doctrine. Homosexuality, it definitely has some issues that I personally don't completely agree with, and so understandably so, I get a lot of criticism for that, and it's tough, like being I guess
in two things that don't seem the same.
Yeah, it's tough having both of those sides. I guess not against me, but you know what I'm saying. I guess I kind of feel like the way some bisexual people might feel, where the straight people don't completely understand me, and the gay and lesbian people don't completely understand me, and it's can be really frustrating. So
I personally admire anyone who's able to stick with that without having bitterness, because I think I have a lot of bitterness.
I'm never one out. I'm not religious myself, but I can respect that certainly, and I see, and this is why I see it in video games, because as I've been saying this whole conversation, real life informs what we see in video games, and it's one of the things people don't think about as much. But even not really counting romance options, as BioWare's concerned, other than who we've already talked about, I don't think I can think of any religious characters who happen to like their own sex.
Who are male, you mean?
Yeah, and people are male, yes. Again, there's double standard with that, as there is almost all across the board with everything, unfortunately. And, just going back to romance in general, one of the things that is not always required, you've got people who maybe would prefer it one way or another, but one of the things that a developer should hopefully try to make to involve in their romances is a certain degree of optionality in multiple ways. Obviously, when it comes to BioWare games, you tend to think of having dialogue options that lead to different facets of a conversation. You've got dialogue options that lead to different in some cases, aspects of a romance. But sometimes, even though it may almost sound counterintuitive because it seems like people tend to play everything they absolutely can in a single playthrough, sometimes optionality is actually one of the more important things for, I don't know, playthroughs that come after the first one where you've pretty much seen everything already and you want to go back to see what you've missed and whatnot. And romances are that way too. I mean, obviously, you can't, for the most part, see every romance in a game in the first playthrough, usually. But
some people try.
In addition to that, of course, there's also the very important possibility of not having any romance at all in games where it's important. You know, obviously some Final Fantasies, and as we talked about, some games, especially back in the day, had romance some capacity be the point of the narrative, the point of what you're fighting for, what you are aiming to receive in a way at the end of the game. But it is very important that you allow people not to have a romance at all, obviously. I think that kind of goes without saying, especially because as many people love romances, there's just as many who sort of feel like you could just throw them to the wind and they wouldn't really care.
Yeah.
But especially in certain instances, optionality is very important. I mean, the examples I have in mind are the infamous spoiler, Shenraiiarnehs the Consort in Mass Effect, who every time I see a Mass Effect playthrough with like a straight female playing it, or otherwise, you get to Shenraiiarnehs the Consort's point. I don't know how much you all know about this, but basically, you have a dialogue option that leads to her having implied sexual relations with you, but you don't know that. So a lot of people sit there and wonder, did I just get, RAPE by Shenraiiarnehs the Consort? And that's a kind of a failing on whoever did that. I mean, you sort of can assume that that's what'll happen since she is a consort, but it basically, the dialogue option just says, okay, is there anything else you can give me? And that's not what most people would think of when you see that option. So that's important, that you try not to make that mistake, certainly. I mean, I guess preaching to developers right now, none of them will probably watch, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, so definitely you don't want to make that mistake, and especially if you are trying to play a certain sexuality or whatnot, and that's especially important, is, you have a lot of games where people, even if they are optional, they throw themselves at you because you're of what they consider to be the right gender, and, obviously BioWare games can be pretty bad about that at some points, more than others. But especially another example is one that people may not have heard of quite as much, and this is actually a pretty decent spoiler for Dragon's Dogma. It's a pretty big spoiler for that game, but towards the end of the game, you basically, and if you are okay with hearing this, obviously, but towards the end of the game, you basically are assigned a love interest, and it can be a huge number of people. It's actually kind of impressive how many different ways they made it to where how many different people you can actually be given as a love interest, even though none of them are particularly well fleshed out or whatnot. But it is absolutely required that you get a love interest, first of all, which is failing in and of itself, I would like to think, because some people aren't even aware of it. You aren't given a lot of warning that that's about to happen. And the other thing is that who you are given as a romance, maybe using the word loosely, is dependent on how much you talk to them, what questions you did for them, and just in general how much you've been around them. And that applies to, shopkeepers, innkeepers, people you have to go to do gameplay.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, but not exactly in the best way possible, because it's possible to end up with, I think one of the options is approaching like child age, which is mitigated by the fact that you are able to create a somewhat child-looking character. Dragon's Dogma is very cool because it has a very, very good character customization that allows you to do a whole bunch of things. But it can be odd when you end up with a character you absolutely hate or who you otherwise were forced to talk to at multiple points. So
I see.
So just a general reminder that optionality is very important.
Yeah.
Certainly, because I remember I was watching Shali's Mass Effect 1 Let's Play recently, and she got the Shenraiiarnehs the Consort part, and And I was just sitting there thinking, okay, Shelley, you're playing her as kind of a renegade. You might not want to pick this particular option. I'm sure it would have been funny, but not for the right reason.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you have that. That's just something for everyone to keep in mind, I think.
Well, I know Shali herself, like, when she was playing Mass Effect 2, was very worried whenever she spoke with Jack and one of the other characters that could be female. I think it might have been Kelly. She was really worried that she might...
actually doesn't play for the female... what did she say? She says, like, I'm not part of the girls' club. She rejected me. So even though she mentioned dating girls before, and maybe Shepard just isn't her type, I don't know.
It might have been Kelly then. I feel like it was Kelly.
That might be
yes.
a problem.
She avoided as much as possible talking to Kelly because she was afraid she might accidentally, like, trigger something romantic with her because she was trying to stay true to Caden the entire time.
Yeah.
So
I actually avoided Kelly for that reason as well. So.
It was not just Kelly, but it was also in Mass Effect 3, the reporter, what's her name? Diana. Yeah, that was the other thing. Diana. She was trying not to get ninja-manced by Diana Allers either.
Yes, and in all fairness, this
ninja-manced.
Yes.
Yeah, it happens. I mean, especially in BioWare
like
games. But,
Anders in Dragon Age 2, a lot of people give him flack.
Yes, and Leliana, unfortunately, and the list goes on. Some plot flags just need to be better set. But anyway, I mean, and this is, of course, what we are talking about is part of the reason why they tend to be hesitant to involve options that might offend someone or whatnot.
Yeah.
In Shaira's case, it was just a really big oversight, and I'm kind of, hopefully they won't make that mistake again.
Yeah.
And in Dragon Age Inquisition's case, it was cool if you knew about it. It was not so cool if you had no idea.
Yeah. Well, why don't we go ahead and move on to the next major section, which is diversity in video games in general. And I think we've pretty much have talked at great lengths, of course, with the LGBT side of things, mostly because of the three of us. I mean, we know that specific topic very well. But let's go into some other forms of diversity in video games. Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and kick off the first topic you want to talk about?
I mean, we've touched a little bit on female representation.
Yep.
And, I mean, basically every single topic we've talked about thus far, the gaming community is having trouble with in one way or another because of its very nature and its history and whatnot. And, however sad it might be, female representation is one of those.
Yeah.
And of course, obviously Kathleen maybe will have more personal things to say on this than us.
Yeah. I know that women in general have definitely gone a long way in video games and how they represented. And I think one of the earliest things about female representation in video games that is very well known to a wide audience, especially people who played the original Nintendo game, is Samus Aran in the Metroid series. Because there's that whole thing where, depending on, when you beat the game, the credits run, and then there's, at the ending, the very last scene, you see Samus, and all of a sudden, the armor that Samus is wearing is removed, and surprise, you've been playing a woman this entire time, which was really huge for its time.
Yeah.
But, so in a way, that was great that, they actually had a way of surprising the player by having a female antagonist who kicked major butt. But then they added the mechanics of, if you played the game perfectly, you had the opportunity to have her appear in less clothing, in a bikini, and we're talking like NES 16-bit bikini, but no, even so. So it was like, I'm glad that you put females in the game, but then you added that whole thing where you just kind of added a little bit more of a sexualization towards Samus. And bothered some people.
Representation is one thing, the kind of representation is another thing.
Yeah.
And that all sorts of what are considered minorities in the gaming community. I mean, stereotypes abound, interests abound, certain appeals abound, and etc.
I definitely want to hear Kathleen's take on female representation in games.
I think when it comes to female representation in games, sexuality tends to be the most complicated thing to deal with, because, women endure a lot of sexual harassment within the gaming community and within gaming companies. I've read like some really scary stories about women who are game developers who had to deal with some really hardcore sexual harassment, even sexual abuse in the industry, and I think it is probably one of the most hard things to deal with because because sexuality shouldn't be a bad thing, and I think what I said in my video about women and sexuality is that sexuality is okay to be a part of a female character, but it shouldn't be the most defining part of a female character.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the way you should deal with sexuality, is that you shouldn't, I don't think that, it's hard to find that balance between having a sexual character a female character that happens to be sexual and a female character that becomes like a sexual object or like sexual, like a prop, and I've gotten beef for saying this, but I actually have a lot of problems with the female characters in The Witcher, even though I love that game. Like, I love that game, but the female characters need a makeover because, they're just sexual in general, and there's not much characterization going on there. But I'm hoping that there's more character development in the third game, especially with Yennefer being introduced, because she is a really interesting character in the books, but I'm not going to go into that. But so I think partly the struggle with creating a female character is finding that very difficult balance between, a female character that happens to be sexual and a female character that is only sexual. Mm-hmm. And I think it's in a degrading and objectifying way, Yeah. And I think objectification can be a positive thing, coming from a loving couple, but then there's another, it's I like what Dan Savage says about, he's like, well, my husband objectifies the hell out of me, and that's totally fine in that instance, mm-hmm. Between loving couples, there can be that type of but
when it becomes a public knowledge sort of thing, when it becomes widespread, when it's nobody's business, yes.
Yeah, but when it becomes this woman has nothing else going for her but her sexuality, that's really problematic, because even prostitutes in real life have more going for them than their sexuality. There's more to their story. Yeah. And I think that's there's a lot of prostitutes in games, and it's weird. You rarely go into the stories behind these women that are just kind of on the side of the street, because in real life, prostitutes, they have families, they have lives, so.
I have always had a very deep respect for gamers who happen to be female, and maybe, I might be very partial, but I just, knowing where female gamers, how far they've come since video games started taking a rise, there's been a steady increase of female gamers over the years. The male population, it still dominates the community of female gamers. But it's getting there, and I think that part of the reason why, especially in the earlier ages, women gamers were less inclined to play games is because of the way that females were portrayed in video games, because they were portrayed in ways that was a bit offensive or that made women gamers uncomfortable. And I'm hoping that one of the reasons why the trend is going up is a sign that game developers are wisening up a little bit and realizing that there are more female gamers out there in their audience, and therefore they have to make sure that the content that they put in is respectful to that audience as well. So go ahead.
Problems, like I said earlier, with I maybe should have checked my sources on this before I said it, but I believe this is still true, that Naughty Dog did sit there and basically more or less not look for any female playtesters for The Last of Us. Again, surprising. But and that just comes from a lot of
most game companies don't. That's the sad thing.
Yeah,
and that's true. I guess in a way you wonder if that's really just an isolated thing. And the truth is, of course, all across the board, there's still work to be done with it.
Yeah.
I think it's wisening up. I mean, certainly BioWare is, in a lot of respects, hugely progressive when it comes to some of this. I mean, there are female BioWare characters that are awesome. I mean, and even what Kathleen was saying earlier is so true that sometimes it's really hard to balance sexuality with facets to where the sexuality is not overpowering while still remaining there. And I would think, and you might agree with me, Hark, on this, is that Isabella from Dragon Age 2 is a pretty good representation of that, because she doesn't go quite as far on the sexual side. Maybe, okay, well.
She can be, I mean, she's pretty, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Have you seen her character design?
That's true. I mean, okay.
She's a part one, right?
She is, yes.
To the audience she's intended to. But I mean, you get some good glimpses into, but that she's more than. Okay, saying Isabella's not sexual is not going to make anyone believe it. I know that.
Isabella is a deeper character. She is, yes.
I think it's interesting that from what I understand of Isabella, she's a character that accepts her sexuality, and I think that's one thing that they don't really explore in games very often either, or just in popular culture, is a female character that is a little more sexually active and is okay with that and open about that. That's something you don't usually see either. In a way of I'm in charge of my own sexual being, and I am sexually active and okay with that, in a positive way.
That is interesting. So. Kathleen, one of the things I wanted to ask you as a woman is if there was one thing about the gaming industry in general that you think can improve upon or change specifically to entice more female gamers to become video gamers, what do you think that would be?
I feel like it's hard to answer the question that because I'm not sure if it's a game development problem. I feel like it's not just a game problem. I think it's a cultural problem.
Okay, go ahead.
I think if I could change anything about just gaming in general or just culture in general, would just be a change in attitude about the role of women. There just seems to be this sexual ownership. This it's this very rape culture driven attitude that basically is this aggressive assertion that women's bodies should be used in the way that any man is and I don't really know how to explain it to someone that doesn't experience that attitude, but it's basically this aggressive flirtation that I encounter in on the internet and in everyday life that is and I'm it's hard talking about this because even talking about this targets you for more abuse, just acknowledging it, but it's when you tell a guy you're not interested, especially if you're a lesbian, it's even worse. There's usually you'll get fired back with this whole I'm just trying to be nice, you're being a bitch, that kind of mentality. And when I say, hey, I'm really not interested in guys at all, it's well, you'll come around, I'm better, I can persuade you. It's very even though I'm saying no, there's a continual pursuit of me. And I don't know if I'm really explaining this well, but there's that attitude exists very much in games and in the gaming community. If you enter a chat room or any type of Xbox, if you go play something live as a woman, everyone will flock on you, and they're just this, and you will get flocked with negativity if you reassert the fact that you're playing games for yourself and not to be objectified by
Mm-hmm.
the male players around you. And I think that is just a cultural problem. It's just this
Gotcha.
idea of women should just accept the sexual harassment that comes towards them and shouldn't fight against it.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah.
So I don't know if I explained that really well.
No, I
but...
think I definitely understand what you're saying. Yeah.
And the reason I call that like a connection to rape culture is because it's like, it's this idea of like, it's this not taking no for an answer. That like it floods into every aspect of like social interaction as well.
Yeah.
You know, like I don't know.
And this is one thing.
A bit of a rant, but
No problem. For those of you who haven't been to her channel, I just wanted to point out that Kathleen made a really awesome video. I believe the topic of her video was about what makes a strong female character. I think that was one of the things you did, Kathleen. So I'll be sure to add a link somewhere up there if you're interested in diving more into this topic, because I think she definitely makes some really awesome points about it for female gamers. So
One thing, I mean, going briefly back to romance, I mean, you know, maybe not too much, but I mean, and this is one thing that people say is maybe one of the adverse side effects of romance, which we touched on a little bit before, especially when it comes to how, I mean, especially like say in Mass Effect, how many different women just are absolutely like gunning to be with a male shepherd and whatnot. I mean, it becomes maybe a little bit easier to maybe just sort of sit there and think insert niceness gets, well, what you want out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's agreeable that that's why, part of the reason why things need to become less formulaic with all of it. I mean, it's part of the reason why I think maybe dating sims are a little bit problematic in the forms that I've played and whatnot. And, you know, not to go too much back into that, but, you know, the more you gamify that, the more it starts to seem like a game in real life, you know, maybe, potentially, depending on the person, obviously. But, so, I mean, so basically, I think that'll get better, at least in video games, over time, as you start to, because here's the thing, I mean, video games can inform real life, or real life can inform video games. You see it going both ways. I mean, certainly, I think possibly the diversity portrayed in BioWare games might have helped some people accept it in real life, and I think accepting diversity in real life has helped BioWare games become more diverse. And so it goes both ways. And certainly, I think all across the board, it's going to get a little bit better depending on that. Some people will say that romance maybe aren't so great for that because it makes things seem like a game when it comes to this. And it makes it seem almost overly superficial some of the time. But I would like to think that it can move past that in a lot of different ways. It's to the point where people will realize that, frankly, even though you're sitting there looking at a screen, you can turn off any single time, that not everything's going to come easy when it comes to virtual social interaction. I think that might be valuable, but you know, other people have different opinions.
Let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is racial and ethnic diversity in video games. And again, this is not necessarily about romance, just diversity in general, ethnic and racial.
And the reason I put racial and ethnic, is because technically speaking, they're different things, even on textbook instance. But of course, you also have like fantasy races, sci-fi races, which are called races, where ethnicity maybe can refer more to culture, maybe to and race, if you want to look at it that way. But certainly, there's a lot to be talked about there. And so, you know, you got BioWare, which does a lot of, a surprising amount of progressive stuff when it comes to who they will show of what race in their games and whatnot. I mean, and race and ethnicity and whatnot. Because actually, I was really surprised in the first Mass Effect to see just how many, you know, relatively speaking, you know, you still have, you know, maybe a dominance of whites here and there and whatnot. You know, obviously, it's getting to points, as with everything else. But I mean, you know, I believe on Novaria, you have a Japanese or otherwise Asian woman. You've got, and I just was playing all of this, and I actually didn't know that, even though it made sense, obviously, for a game set that far into the future, that races would intermingling so widely. it's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, BioWare has actually been pretty good about presenting different ethnicities and presenting just people of different backgrounds of origin and location and whatnot, even in their fictional worlds like Dragon Age, where you basically more or less have worldly, you basically more or less have ethnicities from our world translated to the fantasy world in some degree, and that gives it a good degree of realism and helps you get very interesting.
I think a really good example of that is it might sound like a very simple, minute thing, but Kasumi in the Mass Effect series, I just love how you that Kasumi's Asian, but I love how there's this one dialogue that she has when you're wandering around the Citadel, and she makes mention of ramen, and she's like, Japanese ramen, my mom makes like awesome ramen, and it just was really a simple piece of dialogue, but it's really cool that she was able to identify her heritage, her Asian not just any Asian heritage, but a specific Japanese heritage in the game, even that was something that it had nothing to do with the plot, but it was just really nice flavor that helped make her character seem more real and seem more three-dimensional.
Ramen for the win.
Yeah, ramen. It's all about the ramen.
It's all about the ramen. No, I mean, I think another thing too is sometimes games and just every medium that involves writing and developing characters, they can fall into like these stereotypes. Like, I'm glad that Mass Effect steered away from those.
Yeah.
For the most part, some might argue a few different cases.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But but when I think of a lot of Asian characters, they tend to be like samurais and all these like stereotypical Asian things, and they tend to be like these wise characters, and there's like the whole trope of like the like older, wiser black man in like a story. That is something that like has kind of bled into games as well, as this like godly black male character that like like Morgan Freeman basically is like example
or
of that.
Like Morpheus in I know what you're saying. Yeah,
it's like and few times games or any story give like a black male character an actual voice, and I love like that's why like Lee Everett, because he's the main character and he's not stereotypical, and even like I love that one moment where Kenny like jokes about he's like, oh, you're ethnic.
Hey, Lee, you know how to pick a lock, right?
No. Why would you say that?
Well, you're, urban?
Excuse me, Kenny.
Oh, you are not saying what I think you're saying.
Kenny.
Jesus, man, I'm from Florida.
And he's like, no, I don't know how to break locks. Like, what are you talking about?
Yes, I was actually going to mention Lee Everett as well, because he was such a great main character, not only him, but Clementine as well, who happens to be in at least here in the United States or in North America, like in the minority, an ethnic minority, a racial minority. And that moment you were talking about with Kenny, what was cool about it is that when he mentions it, I was like, oh yeah, that's right, Lee is black. Like, I totally forgot. Like, I totally forgot that Lee happened to be an African American or a black person until Kenny pointed it out to me, and I was like, huh, yeah, that's right. Like,
another thing I love about that too is like there in media, like black men are really depicted as like these scary, like you don't know what they're gonna do. They're potential criminals, and Lee is like the total opposite of that. And like I love that. I mean, he's badass, but he's also really tender, and doesn't live up to all those like stereotypes about like scary black men,
Yeah.
So
this is another. I mean, Walking Dead is another great case of a character who what's different about him is referred to. I mean, different, in relative sense of video game protagonist. I mean, he is an African American man, and so that's referred to at times, but it's not his whole character. Again, right up there with that again. It's not his whole character, And and it is, you can potentially forget for the most part that he's different for the most part. And I mean, you've got Krista and Omid, who I believe are Middle Eastern, and they certainly have none of the qualities that Middle Eastern people are usually portrayed with, or anything like that for the most part. And it's just, I mean, it's great because it feels so real, so much more real, at least. Obviously, as with all things, there are pitfalls here and there. I mean, whenever we started talking about the scary black men trope, I mean, I think of Heavy Rain and Mad Jack, which was a little up there on the ridiculous side.
I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and you also have the sort of mystical sounding acting other black character that Kathleen was sort of mentioning in the same game.
But to be fair,
sorry.
I was gonna say, but to be fair, there were plenty of completely white, like antagonists and scary antagonists in that game as well.
Yeah, this is another thing where this, back in the day, you weren't allowed to have a character like that unless they were a villain. And, it sort of informs certain aspects of it, but we're getting over it gradually. And going back to Mass Effect, as we always do, I mean, some people did take major issue, spoiler alert, with Jacob Taylor, spoiler alert, and his decision to cheat on female Shepard. That came across as very unfortunate for some people.
Yeah.
I think that mostly had to do with the fact that most people couldn't stand his romance, so they just didn't want to bother making a second one. But yeah, the whole baby mama thing, that was really cheap. They could have found a different way to deal with that.
It also doesn't help that they also had, spoiler alert, Thane with the same sexuality, and so there went one option, and here goes another because, And so, I mean, that probably, I think, was unnecessary. I mean, sure, okay, it's different, it's not what you expected, there's something to be said for that, but I will agree that it was a little bit unfortunate.
Since we're on the topic of Mass Effect, I remember, just watching the diversity of romances in Mass Effect over the trilogy, because you started out with having Kaidan and Ashley, and then you added Liara in. Granted, she was an alien race, but she was very, very much female. She was very female looking, human female looking. And then I guess the developers never thought that there would be such a huge Tali following or a huge Garrus following. People were asking for a romance specifically for those two.
Oh, yeah.
And then they added them in. I think, they added them in Mass Effect 2 and then Mass Effect 3 by extension. So, and I found that really, really cool because I know people who were big fans of them and wanted them to romance them, not necessarily because they were physically attracted to them, but they just fell in love with their personalities. And I loved that the basis of this romance was not because of sexual reasons, it was because more of their genuine love of the characters. And it didn't matter to them that they were a different species entirely, an alien race entirely.
That's taking
Garrus isn't that much of a hunk, in my opinion. I know that I'm not the best judge of that, but I did romance both those characters because I wanted to see how the romance developed. I was curious to see how a romance would work with a Turian and with a Quarian who's wearing this freaking mask. How's that gonna work? And they did it really well. I don't know.
I would argue that they're some of the better done romances in the series. So that worked out really well. And so, obviously getting into the other meaning of race, which is the different species, more or less. And that's mostly restricted, of course, to Mass Effect and Dragon Age and such. But you do see more of an inclination towards interest. I mean, one of the things about Mass Effect is maybe to the more uninitiated, you start to get the feeling that, and it's mentioned in game that humans are the the end all be all. That really humans are the most important race. That humans are this. When really in reality, of course, you start getting also more of a feeling for the other races, and it starts to seem less human-centric, arguably, depending on one way or another. But, so yeah, I mean, it's very cool that, and of course, because alien races and fantasy races and whatnot are good ways, even if it shouldn't always be done like this, are good ways of portraying topics that using humans might make seem preachy in a way. Like you talk about exile, you talk about not fitting in, having like a genetic disorder or something like that. You put that in an alien race, and it becomes more understandable, surprisingly, to a certain degree, because it's in a context that you wouldn't expect, and you just end up paying more attention to it that way than maybe if they tried to go for the same thing with humans. I don't know.
Go ahead, Kathleen.
I was just going to say, Shen, I actually think it's interesting that you brought that up because Mass Effect actually borrows some of its tradition from Star Trek, and in that, like, Star Trek, the original, like, one that was aired, like the original one, was deeply about diversity and, like, different people from different countries coming together in one ship. And that, like, you had every person was actually named after like a certain area to represent a geographic region. And that's what I think that was like the whole purpose of that, like diversity, and how which was really revolutionary for the time. And like how people from different cultures can come together and fight for the same cause. And that's what Mass Effect really borrowed that idea from, of like not only different people but different races. And even though we can't really apply that to today's culture because we haven't made contact with aliens yet, but that would be cool if that happened. It's really about like racism and cultural differences that still are really prevalent today, and like working together despite those differences. This was a really powerful message that I think is one of the most powerful messages of Mass Effect.
It's a great way of doing that, I think, and certainly a very successful one thus far. That is very cool. As far as the more fantastical kinds of races, it's a great way of framing things that, as if they were human, might seem more uncomfortable, might seem like it wouldn't be as big of a deal, or in some cases would be more big of a deal. And we might touch on that when it comes to something else later on.
But I think it's a great way to put it into context. Like, the feeling that you get teaming up with these races is probably like the same feeling that people got seeing all these different cultures together on Star Trek when it first aired. Like, it's a way to like kind of allow the new generation to feel that like association with someone that's so different, from you.
Another form of diversity that I was also just thinking of, again, from the Mass Effect universe, is kind of sort of Joker, too, because he's got this, I wouldn't call it disability, but he's got this bone brittle disease that makes it very difficult for him to walk. And I guess a better example of somebody with a disability or disorder would be possibly Sarah from the Walking Dead series as well. I think these are characters that I think are very misrepresented in games, and I think part of it might be because either A, they don't think that their disability might have anything to do with the plot, but it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with the plot. But you also run into the danger of representing a character in a way that could offend people, or that might be very sensitive towards people. Like if you had a character, for example, who had Down syndrome, like I'm curious as to how that character. I would love to see a character with Down syndrome and not having anything to do with the plot, but just to see how that's handled in a way that wouldn't necessarily offend people.
For reference, Glee, the TV series, actually has done that, and I'm not sure how it was received exactly, but so it has been done, and things like that are being done all the time, more and more, progressive as always.
Well, I think. Well, now that I think about it, I'm thinking about Sandal from Dragon Age Origins, there's
True, to a certain extent.
yeah, I don't know. There's something about Sandal that is it's a little off,
There's
and
something about Sandal.
something about that dwarf, and yeah. Now that I think about it, that's pretty interesting and pretty cool. And I'm not really sure. I think there actually is a story mechanic behind why Sandal is the way he is,
We'll
and
probably find out at some point.
yeah, I'd be very interested in seeing if I'm pretty sure we're going to see him in Dragon Age Inquisition. So I'm wondering to see what role he'll play in that. That's
Well,
But even
Go ahead.
even different levels of ability is a type of diversity, and one that should
Mhm.
become more often envisioned.
Kathleen. What were you
well,
going
speaking of Down syndrome characters, I know there's one in. I mean, I can't think of any games, but I know in American Horror Story. I don't know if you've ever watched it. There's a female character with Down syndrome, and she is a really powerful witch, and I love that it kind of, defeated some of the stereotypes, I think, with people that have Down syndrome, that they're not as limited in a lot of ways as you may think they are,
Yeah.
and I think I really liked that she, was a very coherent and very, powerful character, and I think that's what I really like about, Joker. I think talking about characters that have like physical limitations.
Yes.
There's a lot of gamers that have physical limitations. Have some friends that are in wheelchairs, and and they love gaming, but there's very few characters that have those physical limitations that are very strong characters. And I love that Joker is this very capable, strong character, and that his disability, or his physical limitation, is not such a huge deal,
Yeah.
It's also not a plot device for the most part.
Yeah, it's not a plot device either.
Right.
That's really cool.
That's another positive thing that I have to say about video games in general is it has this ability to empower people. Like you can even if you have, for example, physical limitations, you can be Shepard, you can be the hero that saves the entire galaxy, and not only that, you have other supporting characters that also have physical limitations as well, and yet they are strong characters and they matter. Like they matter to the story and they matter to what's going on around you. And I just love the ability of video games being able to do that.
Well, this is the big meat of the topic, I guess, surprisingly enough. But I mean, when you think of maybe offering a diverse selection of romance options in a video game, I mean, I think especially, for developers, the first thing that would come to mind is, for good developers at the very least, what are the genders of the romance options, and in addition, if it applies, what are their sexuality and whatnot. I mean, there obviously are games that only allow for one gender and of course only allow for one sexuality. Certainly that much hasn't changed. And there's just some stories that are better suited to that. It depends. You'll see examples all the time. It's not necessarily a hugely universal thing. But that is basically the baseline, I guess you could say, of romantic diversity. And the one that game companies are most likely, like BioWare, to consider is, are you giving, if not equal, enough romance options for either gender and either sexuality, if applicable. As with all things we've been talking about, that has gone up a whole lot in recent years to the point where it's starting to become fairly commonplace. It's still largely confined within BioWare and other more progressive game companies that really try and strive to provide that kind of diversity as much as possible. I mean, this is why these games are so great for women. This is why these games are so great for homosexuals, bisexuals, and people of any non-heterosexual sexuality, is just because it gives them options where they did not have it before in a lot of other different games. I mean, certainly there's still games nowadays where you can't be a woman, where you can't be gay, where you can't be any of those, and these offer a great opportunity to have, I mean, as we've brought up before, to have that representation and have that experience of being able to have a game that includes it. I mean, maybe for life if it's your first. So I mean, that's pretty much it on the gender and sexuality. But I mean, I like to think of the non-heterosexual options as gay options, and I've actually done quite a bit of looking into games that have gay options and whatnot, because they are still fairly limited. I mean, like I said before, and it still is mostly true almost all across the board, is that gay men typically still get the least amount of options in any game for the most part when it comes to being romantically involved for a number of reasons that we've pretty much already touched on. Sorry, just a second. I guess, I mean, you have sort of a history, vaguely speaking. It's sort of been dispersed all across the timeline. You know, you have certain concentrations of it at one point, and then, you know, some people might not go for it in the next generation or whatnot. But I think what I have it here is that, like, the Ultimate series, or at least like the middle games of the Ultimate series, I mean, there's a lot of games in that series, included not necessarily romance. You know, again, in early days, it wasn't so much about the romance as it was about the more base carnal instincts involved, but that allowed for just in general, just for you to do anything with someone of the same sex. In this case, I believe it was, you know, vaguely similar to prostitution. You know, go figure. But then I think that was like in the 1990s, probably the early to maybe mid-late 1990s was that series, and it was, you know, it was what it was for the time. And then 1996, not necessarily the best example either, but Bahamut Lagoon apparently, even though basically everything romantic in that game was played more or less for laughs. I mean, surprisingly, it wasn't just the gay option that was played for laughs. Apparently, the straight option was also just supposed to be kind of silly and whatnot. Allowed for the player to declare a preference for a same-sex member of the group that they were in, as opposed to designated love interest and whatnot. Was obviously heterosexual female and whatnot, and it just kind of took off from there. I mean, needless to say, it's still not that prevalent, but it is becoming more and more. And you know, again, there's all sorts of reasons for that. Not the least of which is what some people like to call the straight male gaze. And this also covers a whole lot of other things. Mostly just involving double standards, especially when it comes to homosexuality between genders. You know, we've touched on this, and the truth is, it is still true that you see lesbian options being put into games as much to appeal to straight males as you do for lesbians. I mean, you know, depending on how they're written and whatnot, sometimes can make a difference. But as we know, sometimes that's just the way it is. You know, you definitely see the effects. I mean, especially in Mass Effect and whatnot, you definitely get that sense. I mean, and it doesn't even have to be actually surprisingly enough about homosexuality. I mean, definitely a trend that I notice all the time, even in movies and, you know, any media that tries to show things visually and whatnot, is that you, even in a scene that involves a man and a woman, as most do, obviously, you know, heterosexuality is the dominant form, you tend to focus, if there's sexual aspects, you tend to focus more on the sexual aspects of the woman than you do of the man, whatever those sexual aspects may be. And the thing that immediately comes to mind, we brought up The Witcher earlier, the thing that comes to mind is that I've seen videos of the more adult content in The Witcher, and you could just tell so much that that game was created for straight men and as no one else, because okay, and this is also true in a movie I saw. It was like, I think it was Jack and Jill Vampire Hunters or something, where they have a tendency to put a male and a female character who are going to bathe together, more or less skinny dipping, and they go to all this huge trouble of having the woman disrobe, and you can pretty much see everything. She does it so sexily. And then the guy basically just ends up in the water. You don't see anything that he did. Sometimes he doesn't even take off his pants or whatnot. And and you can just so tell, wow, they knew, or they thought they knew who their demographic was going to be. And of course, you know, and that's, of course, part of the reason why you don't tend to see gay options and such like that more often, especially, let's be honest, the males. Because straight males, for the most part, do not want to see gay men, and in some cases are extremely offended by seeing the gay men. And so, therefore, there is apparently a need for a whole lot of censorship, as we know.